Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is a little bit different than my sort of usual beat. I am talking to the writer, novelist, programmer, and just general interesting person, Robin Sloan. Robin is the author of one of my very favorite books, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, which felt like one of those novels that just touched on everything that I was interested in. It was about books and reading. It was about design and typography and technology in San Francisco and secret societies. I just completely devoured it and have recommended it to so many people over the years. It was just this like really great novel. And last year, a second novel, Sourdough, was published, and it was this equally just exhilarating, fun, upbeat read that I can't recommend enough. But before all of this, Robin worked in media. He held jobs at Current TV and Twitter, and he blogged on a great website called Snark Market, which is kind of where I discovered him during my senior year of college. He also dabbles in programming and machine learning and manages an olive grove with his partner where they are making and selling their own olive oil. Yes, we talk about all of this, but Robin is not a designer, but I feel like so much of his work is sort of design adjacent. He has this term media inventor that he uses to describe himself in his work, and we use that to open the conversation and talk about what it means to be a media inventor and the interest in working with both content and its container. And as you'll probably quickly see, design, I think, is a type of media invention, and this leads to a truly fascinating conversation that covers everything from writing fiction to design fiction to working in media to pursuing various creative projects and dabbling in various media. I had a blast with this one. Robin is someone whose work and thinking I've admired for basically my entire adult life, and I've had the pleasure of getting to know him over the last couple of years, and I'm just so glad that we got to record this conversation. I think you're really going to like it. Remember, if you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year to receive an exclusive monthly newsletter with additional content and episode previews. I feel like I'm finally getting the hang of writing these newsletters. I think each one's getting better than the one before it. And the next one actually goes out this week. So these memberships really help keep the podcast going. I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with my friend, Robin Sloan. I think I discovered you and your work, or first came across you and your work, almost 10 years ago. I think it was when I was a senior in college. Okay. And I think it was through Snark Market.
Sure. Yeah.
And you've done a lot of different things in those 10 years, but something that I think is a constant is this term media inventor or media invention. And so I think that's actually a really good way to kind of try to frame all of this, is to start by just talking about that term and what that means. So how did you, well, like first, could you kind of just describe what that means to you? I know you have it on your website, but just talk a little bit more about that, and then how you arrived at that
yeah,
term.
Of course. I mean, it came out of a struggle of mine to describe both what I was doing and also kind of what I wanted to do, you know, what I was interested in or aspiring toward. And there just didn't seem to be a lot of other labels out there, because I always felt myself, you know, and this is particularly true of kind of digital projects or experiments for the web or for phones or things like that. You realize kind of halfway into making it that the format doesn't have a name. You know, you can't, and there's no festival that you're going to send it to. There's no critical infrastructure. There's no like, oh, well, it's kind of like this, but mixed with that. I mean, there's no this or that. You're really kind of off the map in a lot of ways. And that can be, frankly, a little bit scary. It can be frustrating because you can't even explain what you're doing. You feel a little naked. You feel out there. And so I guess coming up with that terminology and that little storyline really around being a media inventor was kind of a way for me to make some armor, just to kind of like strap on these plates and say like, no, I'm doing something here. Even though a lot of these experiments kind of end up being a little sparklers in the dark. They kind of come and they go, or they're successful to different degrees, which means that sometimes they're not successful at all. But I just wanted language, and of course, just like anything else, I mean, this is true. The first time you actually call yourself a writer, you change your Twitter bio to include the word writer, or a musician, or animator, or designer, or whatever. There's that sort of brace for impact, like, oh no, I'm not actually, and everybody else knows it, and they're gonna call me a nerd and think I'm dumb. For sure, the first time I had been sort of using that word in my own mind and maybe saying it out loud to people, media inventor, for a while. But then I finally did articulate that little section on my website. And of course, because you always are, I was a little nervous and self-conscious at first. But in retrospect, I am really glad that I did, because first of all, other people have said, wow, I really like that idea. Maybe I like that specific language. Maybe I just like kind of what you're expressing there. And then also just for me, it has been that stake in the ground and that reminder that, some things about your own brain and the kind of magnets that pull you just can't change. And for me, it's forever. It's been that sort of weird stuff on the edge, those inventions.
I think I don't mean to so quickly bring this into design, but because I'd like to talk about other things besides design today also. But I think this idea, the term has always really resonated with me, and I've never called myself that, but it's something that has always felt like the things that I'm interested in, and especially this idea of kind of giving equal weight to both the content and the container, and how those things can start to talk to each other. And I think that's kind of what design is, or at least what graphic design is also. And something that I'm really interested in is kind of challenging those containers a bit, especially, you have someone comes to you and they say, we need a book designed, or we need a poster designed, that all of those words, book, poster, website, also seem like they have really rigid definitions, but they don't have to be the way we think about them. Yeah, I think that's kind of a media invention,
As I know, absolutely. That's actually a really important insight. That's what grounds this whole thing. That it's not that there is one class of media inventions and another class of eternal media objects, that have existed for humans to use from before the dawn of time. In fact, they were all media inventions at one point. And I have to say, as I'm kind of thinking about it here on a little thread in my brain, I'm remembering that actually writing my first novel, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, and doing some of the research about the history of books and the history of printing that went along with that was actually quite formative in coming up with that terminology or that framework for myself, because I had, I guess, known a little bit about where books came from and Gutenberg, but honestly not much, not as much as I should have. And I learned a ton more. I really got into kind of the nitty gritty material and economic and certainly cultural history of books. And you come to realize that everything that we now take for granted as being warm and familiar and comfortable and sort of well understood and maybe even eternal, if we don't really have the right perspective, they truly, these things were invented by particular people at a particular time, often in a very particular place, and we know what that place was. And that's really exciting to me because it means there's a path forward for these weird experiments, or there can be. And so it was kind of learning about that context that then emboldened me to think a little more seriously about what this kind of work means. And but yeah, I think that's so important.
Where I want to go back in time even further. Where did this interest that you have in kind of playing with these forms and kind of, for lack of a better word, dabbling in all of these different media, is this something you've always been interested in?
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of seems oversimplistic that a big question like that could have a simple answer, or an answer as simple as the one I'm about to tell you. But truly, I've thought about it a lot and sort of inspected my own memory and thought back. And it all goes back to the arrival of a Macintosh in my life. And of course, I think that's a very common story. Yeah. And it was just one of those things where you realize you intersect with something at a really ripe and interesting age. I was a kid, maybe this was 1987 or 1988, so I'm 7 or 8 years old at that time. and my parents come home with a Macintosh Plus. And I
Yeah.
don't know exactly where they got this Mac Plus, or like why this was the thing at that time. I mean, I guess they had some sense that this was going to be a interesting machine to have in the house, but I just gravitated towards that thing. And the Mac at that time, it was so rudimentary now in retrospect, but there were things like HyperCard, which I totally
Yeah.
glommed onto.
Yeah.
Somehow, I got my hands on a copy of Director, which was, this sort of simple drawing,
Oh, yeah.
interaction, animation program, even stuff like Mac Paint, just being able to I created little pixelated comics and I printed them out. My mom helped me figure out how to print them out in a way that I could then fold a piece of paper to make a simple little booklet,
Yeah.
And that was it. So that, I mean, like, there was this beige box where all media, including forms of media that I had not before then known existed, all came together on one little, like, 8-inch monochrome screen. And so,
Right.
yeah, that was the beginning. Once I had sort of started to mash it all up there and just have the opportunity to kind of exactly dabble in all these different things there, I never saw any reason to give that up as the years went on.
Yeah, that I want to kind of quickly go through your background, kind of leading us up to today, because I find this really interesting. Because I was the same way, and I remember when we got our first computer. I was about the same age, and it had Microsoft Print Shop Deluxe on it, and I'd like go grocery shopping with my parents or something, and I would come home and I would open up Microsoft Print Shop Deluxe and try to recreate all the signs that I had seen in the grocery store.
That's awesome.
And I've at the time didn't have the word graphic design to define that thing that I did, but looking back, it's clear from 6, 7, 8 years old, the things that I'm doing now were kind of planted back then. And so the question I'm getting to is what did you, when you thought about growing up, what were you interested in? What did you want to do when you grew up? How did these things start to kind of come together for you?
That's a great question. To tell you the truth, I didn't know.
Yeah.
And I guess what I mean is, I mean, I knew what I was interested in. I knew what kind of frequencies I resonated on, because you can just feel that, you can sense it. I have to say, though, I grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, in a context, like in a family and just a broader social scene that was not. I mean, it's just, especially, I just think about what I know now and the people I know now, the kind of jobs they have, the kind of work they do.
Yeah.
I mean, this is so funny, and maybe it's overly simplistic, but I had not met a freelancer, someone who lived their life in that way, kind of piecing together work and sort of jumping from client to client, until I was in like my mid-20s and moved out to the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Before that, my entire context of just work and life was this model, and this is a very Michigan thing, this is a very kind of suburban Detroit thing. The whole model was you get a job somewhere, probably at a car company, and you work there for decades. And again, like, this is probably oversimplistic. There were obviously other things that I heard about and knew about, but it really wasn't there in my life. And so I cannot say that I had a really broad palette of possibilities to sort of choose from or look at. And what substituted, honestly, this is not a bad thing. I mean, I went to a great public high school and was like well supported and well educated. So please, I hope this doesn't sound like a complaint or belly aching at all, but there's that sort of funnel for kids who are good at taking tests, people who just kind of naturally do well at the PSATs and find calculus kind of copacetic. Even if calculus is not actually what's like burning at the center of their heart, it's something they can do, and there's real rewards for that kind of social, and I don't know, just sort of a weird system that says, oh yes, this is the right direction. And so I got kind of sucked up in that that pneumatic tube of like the honors kid. And so I think truly, if you had asked me like in high school or even well into college, well, yeah, what are you going to do? What's your life? It was sort of being a smart person, maybe going to law school, maybe going to medical school, maybe being some sort of, I know it's so strange and sounds so foreign to me now, but the truth is I didn't have kind of templates of people leading creative lives, or even doing design or doing digital work. It really was the kind of that default set of like fireman, garbage collector,
right,
lawyer.
right. This is so interesting for me to hear because I feel like I was similar. Like when you talking about how you had never met a freelancer, or that seems so foreign. I've talked to other people on the podcast about this before, that my introduction to graphic design was through blogging. I had never met a real graphic designers. Didn't live in the suburban town that I grew up in. That was not a thing people did, and it was this thing that I kind of found online and learned about through blogs, really. How did media for you, I'm using that term broadly, how'd you realize that was a career, that was something that you could actually do as a job? Where did you start to learn that?
That's a great question. I think the answer is similar broadly. It's the internet.
Yeah, of course.
The answer is the internet. For me, it was kind of a late stage swerve. I had studied economics in school and was pretty sure I was going to, as late as my sort of junior year, I did this big project, this study abroad research deal, all about development economics. I was sure that I was going to kind of pass along into that world and try to go to some graduate program and kind of do all that smart person, high achiever sort of do-gooder stuff. And I'll tell you what happened. Again, it sounds so overly simple that this must be like one of those stories that's like simplified over time. In fact, it was this simple. I was studying abroad in Bangladesh for a semester. Okay. This was in the spring of 2001 with a friend of mine, another student at Michigan State University. We were both there together doing a big project and kind of teaching some English classes to support ourselves and whatever else. And as we were doing this research and writing this big paper, we were also making a little website because I had picked up the rudiments of HTML and kind of knew how to throw something together in the little hosting space that we were all allotted on the Michigan State web server. And so we called it the Dhaka Daily. It was the little dispatch of our adventures for our friends and family back home. And this is a time before, Skype and before really ubiquitous high-speed internet. And so there was a real sense, a kind of old-fashioned sense of being quite distant and disconnected from all the people we cared about, and really people who cared about us. There was a real sense from a lot of our friends and family, like, are you guys gonna be okay over there? So we wanted to assure them that we were in fact okay. So we ended up producing it like this rinky-dink little newspaper. It wasn't quite a blog. It should have been a blog, but it was just a beat before that moment in time. So it was this rinky-dink little newspaper. We took a lot of photos. We wrote these little articles, tried to sort of transform our experiences into these little modules that people could actually consume and enjoy. And of course, like the punchline, you can see the punchline coming. Making that dorky little website for our friends and family was so much more fun and engaging and satisfying than the economics research work. It just was, you couldn't ignore that difference. It was so stark and so palpable. And to my young self's credit, I did actually take note of that feeling. I didn't brush it off. I didn't come back to school in East Lansing and kind of go, oh, well, that was weird. Onward. I actually took it to heart and made this hard left. And in my last year of college, decided I was going to try to find some way to do that, some way to get started with media, web media, journalism. I had no credentials, again, no templates, no idea how a person even did that. And so I had to kind of stumble my way forward. But that was it. That was the turn. I watched my own heart in operation and for once actually paid attention to what it was doing. Yeah.
So what was that like? Like how'd that turn look in the moment?
It was tough. I applied for a bunch of things, including my most coveted sort of post-college gig would have been an internship at This American Life. Oh. Then, and it's just, it's still, obviously This American Life is still amazing, but it was the coolest thing in the world at that time. Oh, and it was in Chicago, which of course is like the big city, or the biggest city I could then imagine.
Right.
And I produced this whole kind of tryout podcast, I guess, some sort of weird radio production, wrote this just like deeply felt essay, sent it all in, was rejected. Very, very kindly rejected. Rejected for a few other, kind of core journalism things too. And it's one of those lucky things where you just encounter the right thing at the right time and find a slot that's sort of
Right.
shaped the right way for your weird shape. There was a place called The Point, there still is, a place
Oh,
called
yeah,
the
yeah.
Pointer Institute down in St. Petersburg, Florida. I, of course, at that time didn't know anything about it, but it's people in journalism do know about it. It's this terrific sort of school and think tank created by the bequest of a local newspaper owner there in Tampa Bay, who rather than give his newspaper, the St. Petersburg Times, which was a very successful and still is a successful and really, really well respected kind of regional paper, rather than sell it to some big conglomerate or even just give it to his children, his descendants, he essentially created this institution. He took now the profits of the paper flow into this institution that is designed to just make American journalism better.
Right.
So they were, at the time, it was kind of early web days, and very wisely, I think, they were like, oh man, we need some more help with this website. Maybe we can get some young people who have a bit of native experience at this stuff and who need to learn. Like, maybe we can kind of do a trade. You come here and you learn about journalism, and you also upload a lot of files to this FTP server and,
right.
change a lot of designs the old-fashioned way. And that was perfect for me because I knew how to upload files to an FTP server. Truly, I had exactly the right set of kind of low-end technical skills, and I could write and I could edit. I had that facility with language, and I wanted to learn. So it just ended up being this perfect match. I had a fellowship there for 2 years doing that kind of work, learning a lot, and yeah, that was it. That was the bridge for me.
But did you? What's has always what I've always been interested in about you and your work, and even hearing you talk about this kind of early part of your career, I keep thinking about, you're talking about kind of studying journalism, but you never really stayed in one lane. Did you, correct me if any of this is wrong in retrospect, but it doesn't seem like you actually tried to be a journalist in the traditional sense. You know what I mean?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah.
And when I first kind of discovered your work, I think you were still at Twitter, probably, which, and I don't really know. I mean, we can talk about that a little bit too if you want. But you were always kind of outside of, you know what? I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this. You had these interests, but you were kind of always circling them in these very different ways. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do. I do know what you mean. And I think as I kind of reflect on those early years at Pointer and directly after and kind of finding my own path, I think that there was part of it that was voluntary and part of it is involuntary. The voluntary part was where the kind of, the strategic or the choices I was making consciously, they did have to do with kind of what was needed in the world and what I maybe uniquely was good at. I did, and there's, of course, other people kind of contemporaneously. You could make a whole list of folks who sat just really right at that intersection where the worlds of sort of words and media and pictures and journalism and stories and the internet, and blogs and technology kind of ran into each other. And, of course, that's still not all sorted out. In the early 2000s, it was really not sorted out. It was super stressful and chaotic and weird and apocalyptic and exciting and everything else. And I just saw that I was there. I just naturally, like, that's where in a way I had been kind of waiting at that intersection for a little while, and suddenly the whole world arrived. And so there were a lot of opportunities kind of connected to being able to think through those things and build new things. And I was like, I would be happy to do that. In exchange for a biweekly paycheck from various small to large corporations. That was the part that was conscious, but I do want to say, importantly, that there was and always has been this other part that's pretty involuntary, and there just have been these compulsions. There have been many opportunities through my working life or career or all the stuff that I've been doing, whatever you can call it. There have been many opportunities to sort of settle down or pick a lane, to use your terminology, to be like, this is it. This is it. I published a novel. It was a success. I could just do that now. I could sit and write novels and people want to read them, and like, what a thing. I I don't seem to be able to do that. And sometimes, I mean, truly, not. I don't mean this in sort of one of those sort of self-deprecating ways, like, I'm so hard to handle. No, truly, like to my own frustration.
Yeah.
I don't seem to be able to do that. And so that's just, at this point, I've made my peace with it. I just know that that's how my mind and my heart work. I want to be able to jump around. Something kind of pushes me to jump around and kind of try things that I'm not qualified to do. But I can't say that that's a strategic choice. That's
Right.
just deep in the cells.
Yeah, well, I mean, the reason I ask that is because I feel like the older I get, the more I realize I don't think I knew that I was that way until 3 or 4 years ago, where I thought that I thought, I mean, even the way you're kind of talking about all of these things you were interested in, they were all the same things that I was interested in, but I discovered this word design that felt like it held them all together, and then I had settled into that lane. And then when I started working as a designer, I realized that that was actually very limited to all of these things that I was interested in. And this is reminding me, I talked to Peter Mendelsohn recently, and he used this term art monster from Jenny Ophil's book Department of Speculation. The main character in that, I haven't read the book, but it's been on my list since he told me this, because this term I've just carried it around since that interview, which was like 6 months ago now or something. And the main character in this book refers to herself as an art monster. And Peter Mendelsohn said that when he found that was the best way he could describe his interest, in that he just kind of had this need to make things that weren't there before, and wasn't that concerned by whether it was graphic design or writing or music or painting.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's kind of you also.
You know, what I love is that those two terms, and by the two terms I mean art monster and media inventor, so clearly solve some of the same problems,
right,
but they do it with like this very different valence or tone or like flavor.
Yeah.
Of course, media inventor has the shading of kind of it's more technical, and it's sort of the mad scientist in her lab full of crackling lightning bolts. And of course, the art monster is the mad painter in her studio, sort of flecked with paint and sort of, crying unexpectedly for reasons she doesn't understand, but then she like transforms that, into something on the canvas. And it's kind of like they do the same things. And as you say, like when you hear those words, you're like, or those labels, you encounter those labels and you go, that might be it. There might be a word for this. But I'm really quite tickled by how those two things kind of do the same work, but in totally different ways.
Yeah. So what, just to kind of finish this thread of your career, when you were working at Twitter or Current, that was media related also, right? Like what were you kind of doing there?
Yeah, it really was. And both those jobs, even though they were very different, there was a core similarity, which was that for better and for worse sometimes, I was one of the people who was going to figure out, or going to try to figure out, how media and technology fit together, how they interact, how they might interact. And it kind of flipped around, the polarity almost inverted. At Current, it was being situated in a media company that was very interested in technology, sort of figuring out like, okay, how do we do this right? How do we not be one of the old dumb media companies that's sort of stumbling forward and saying, hello, fellow kids, here is our web portal. And then at Twitter, it was a technology company that was very deeply interested in media. And it was exactly the same thing. How do you be a technology company that's not saying, hey, media, cool party we're all having here, all us cool media people at this cool party. Anybody want to post something on social media or whatever? And I think the people I worked with were successful and unsuccessful to different degrees, kind of along the way, trying to do both those things. But it was fundamentally about that, both that sort of technical and strategic puzzle, but then also the social piece of it, like just having actually good conversations kind of across those communities and across those worlds.
What was I'm curious about your relationship to, I mean, because this is technically a design podcast,
Yeah.
your relationship to design, or that word design, because I've found that the Venn diagram of the word media and the Venn diagram of the word design are much more overlapped than I originally maybe realized, and have found a lot of my interests. Media feels like a good word for a lot of those things. And I feel like a lot of this conversation, design is this kind of idea that's kind of threaded throughout, kind of on the periphery. And I'm curious just your relationship or kind of thoughts around that word even.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, sort of two parts to it just leap to mind. One is that just as with meeting my first freelancer, coming to the Bay Area was really the first time I met proper designers. I'd worked for some designers before. I shouldn't say that, not proper designers. People who could articulate and sort of theorize what they were doing and explain it. I mean, I think of someone who worked at Current in the early days who became a great friend of mine. For sure, the coolest looking designer I'd ever met up until that point. Like my friend Paul, he especially at that time, he played the part in just a super, super appealing way. And the way he also,
amazing.
It was early days kind of designing this whole TV network and the accompanying website and all the things it was going to do. And so not only did he kind of create the wireframes and the flows and the sort of shape of this thing, but he explained to us what he was doing and how he was thinking about it. And to me, that was a revelation. I mean, I just had never heard anyone talk like that before. And it was really exciting and just interesting. And really, it's like what an engaging process, like this wonderful ongoing puzzle. And, everybody gets to be smart together and you're making these beautiful things and they're beautiful because they're simple and blah, 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 blah. So that was cool. And of course, that continued all through my time at Current and on through Twitter, where there were some amazing, like just really thoughtful designers. I did realize pretty early on in those conversations that on a pretty fundamental level, design was not for me temperamentally, because I saw that the really good designers were about solving problems. I mean, that's what they said. That's usually what they did. Not always what they did, but it's usually what they did. But like, it's so clear that this was, and maybe this was more of a sort of a fashion of the moment than I realized. I definitely don't have that full kind of context of how designers have thought about their work and talked about their work. At that time, it was really like, let's solve problems. Let's sort of make these tasks easy for users and viewers. Let's get out of the way. And always, I mean, early on, my reaction silently at first to myself and then eventually out loud was like, but I don't want to solve problems. I want to like create problems.
Right.
I actually want to get in people's way and in their face and slow them down and make them feel weird. Just that whole sort of service provider problem solver model just so did not speak to me and still doesn't. It never has. So I kind of knew early on that probably wasn't going to be a path that I kind of pursued. Yeah,
I mean, that's so interesting. I feel like so much of this podcast has become trying to dispel of this notion that design is just problem solving and that there are all of these kind of other ways that you can practice, or that design can do these other things just besides selling a product, which is why I think media, just to completely bring it back to the beginning, why I think media inventor is such a great word is because this idea of shaping content and container together, to me, just seems like the design process. Like that's like what I want to do, But you've obviously, even if you realized that maybe you couldn't be a designer or the temperament of the designer didn't match you've maintained an interest in it. And I think I mentioned this to you in one of our emails. I see Penumbra as being a book that is essentially about design in a lot of ways. Do these ideas of design, how do they kind of filter into this work that you're doing, even if we don't call the work design work?
Yeah, I mean, so they filter in deeply. It's the broadest definition of. It's so funny. Even if we were having this conversation and we're trying to kind of broaden it and reframe it, but even so, I hear myself saying design, and I think this is actually really interesting. It kind of like clamps down for me. I think of websites and like banking forms, truly.
Yeah.
And apps, like really smooth, simple, like, oh, this app is so well designed. What's interesting to me, I mean, what I'm about to describe is, or could be design. I guess in my mind, I would call it like visual culture or something, stuff, drawings. But I mean, everything. Pictures, comic books, graphic novels, typography for sure. I mean, like Penumbra it's a sort of suspense novel, and all the suspense has to do with a font. It's like the thrilling tale of a typeface, and all that stuff. Like, just I'm one of those people that definitely, like, at used bookstores, or like when I find things online, I'll buy a book just because I think it has a few images in it that I haven't ever seen before, like the kind of thing I've never seen before, and I'll never see anywhere else. And the idea that I'll just like look at that and it'll be in my brain, kind of stewing with everything else, is worth the $15 or the $25 to like get this artifact. So that stuff is hugely, hugely important. It definitely filters into my fiction, into all my writing. Of course, I mean, some of the things that I produce on the web, I do design them in a sense. I lay them out on the page and choose the typefaces and make pictures and everything else. But I think it's so telling that when I try to think of all of that whole sweep of things hitting my eyeballs, I have a hard time calling it design.
I'm gonna try to connect this in a clear way, and this might be a complete turn in the conversation, but I'm thinking about kind of everything that we've been talking about, and the way that design maybe feels limiting to you. And we've talked about how you've kind of moved between these different mediums, or these different genres or forms. But the other constant through all this is calling yourself a writer. And you'd mentioned early on about that kind of, nervousness of using Media Inventor and comparing that to the first time you call yourself a writer. How did writing become so central to all of these things?
I think that story for me is runs parallel to the story you hear from a lot of folks, in the sense that I was a reader as a kid, voracious, insatiable reader. I mean, and truly catalyzed by the public library. We had a really, really tremendous public library in Troy, Michigan, where I grew up. And I still, if I go back there to walk through the little automatic front doors and smell that kind of slightly stale booky smell in there, I mean, it brings tears to my eyes. That was my spot. That is it was very important kind of place where I was invented, or sort of was created by all those things that I encountered and all the choose your own adventure books that I consumed and everything else. So that's been there and deep for a long time. Again, I think this runs parallel to a lot of people's stories. It got subsumed by a lot of other, kind of elbowed aside by a lot of other things over the years, whether that was other forms of media that I was more interested in, whether that was other kinds of work or ambitions for myself. But I was always a kid that was writing things or drawing comics. And not just a little kid. In college, I would find weird opportunities or excuses to draw comics for assignments, or to write things perhaps with a little more flair than I had to.
Right. Yeah.
By the letter of the syllabus. And so it was always there. I sometimes think of it as like an underground river, kind of, flowing through the cracks in the rock. And it's got real force. It's not going to get bottled up. It's just invisible or quiet maybe for a while. But then it finds the places or the moments where it's going to leap up to the surface again. And for me, I truly can imagine an alternate timeline where it, even today, is still kind of bubbling down there. For me, I just was really, really lucky. I had two colleagues at Current TV who had underground rivers of their own, and we all kind of like recognized each other, and we're like, oh, you're into that kind of stuff too. Oh, you love reading too. Oh, you love reading this particular kind of like very nerdy book as well. Interesting. Right. And so we ended up teaming up. We formed a little writing group. There were just three of us, and it was just the reason to sit down and write something, even if it was something really short or something really raw or rough. Because you had some people you were going to share it with. We had pretty regular meetings where we'd swap drafts and kind of talk about them and give each other notes. And that's, for me, I mean, it was a long process of starting to take it more seriously and doing longer, more substantial projects. But it was, for me, that sort of social catalyst that brought that stream back up to the surface.
And what kind of things were you writing in that time and with that group, was it fiction?
Yeah, it was all we that's for all of us,
Okay.
then and even now, what we were all fiction readers, fiction writers. I think we of course, different writers and different minds. We all liked sort of fiction of the weird,
Yeah.
science fiction,
Yeah.
fantasy, stuff that kind of played with sort of the sense of the reality around us, and in particular, I mean, this has always been true for me, but in particular at that time in sort of the 2000s, I just really glommed onto fiction that seemed to capture the moment we were in an almost dizzying way. And I think in particular of the trilogy of books written by William Gibson that begins with pattern recognition. Those are also design books in a very
you're right.
serious way. And they of course for him were kind of they really were it was a big deal for me to read them kind of contemporaneously, because they were his first books that were not set in a sort of fictional near future. In fact, they were, by the book, they were set in the recent past. Like at the time each one came out, its events sort of were a few years prior. But of course, because they were Gibson books, they were actually taking place in these sort of like hidden, curled up futures that exist in every world. And so they still felt like reading about the near future or really about the future 15 minutes from now. It just was such a cool feeling to read them and be like, oh man, this is it. This is the world we're living in. Right. So I was very compelled to find more things like that, which was hard, and then ultimately to try to write stuff like that as well. That was really my goal. I wanted to, if I had a genre, that was going to be it. Sort of the fiction of the near future, the fiction of the world 15 minutes from now.
I have a theory that I want to run by you of your own work, and this could be kind of retrospect. It might be easy to put this pattern onto your work,
right? Of course.
But as I was thinking about this conversation, as I was thinking about you as a writer, I was struck by how it seemed like again, this comes back to media invention. These new forms were having such an influence on what you were writing, whether that was Snark Market and just this idea of blogging, whether it was Kindle singles, and then this idea of a novel, or even Fish, this idea of playing with an iOS app. And I'm curious, one, if you were kind of aware of that at the time, or if that was a conscious thing, but this idea of how the form that the writing takes influences how you think about both the output and the process.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's fascinating, of course, endlessly fascinating. The idea of there's been some situations where I've been asked to write things or had to write things that would, of course, have some form eventually, but you don't really, as the writer, as the word provider, you don't really get to see it. And that includes like magazine stories, where it goes, especially for some magazines. I've actually stopped doing this because I had a few experiences that were just kind of rough, where the text went through such a meat grinder, or not a meat grinder. That sounds too violent. More like through like a car wash or something. They were like maybe a sous vide machine. I don't know. I'm not sure what the metaphorical process is here. But it was like, what I saw on the page was one thing, and then what emerged way on the other end was like really quite different. And those transformations had not been mine to make, and in fact had been made totally outside of my control or consultation or whatever. And of course, for a lot of people writing for like a long time, maybe most of the 20th century and beyond, that's just like, yeah, dude, that's what publishing is. Like that, right. Yes, that's how it works. But I think it matters that, Snark Market matters in that experience, that so much of my earliest writing in public was using a system and kind of a way of doing things that was totally under my control. I could publish something, see a typo and fix it. I could publish something, read it the next day, see some sentence that just kind of was like, oh, that's a clunker, and change it. And of course, this is where the typography and the kind of design really does come into it. I would change sentences to fix the way they fell on the screen. I'd be like, ugh. Yeah. Oh, that's ugly. That looks like shit. Like, oh wait, maybe if I kind of beef this up and add an adjective, oh, much better. Oh, that's prettier. Which is maybe a silly way to write. But for me, it seemed really natural. And so really that not only the desire, but really the expectation that you would get to consider form and content together. For me, it has to begin with blogs. And I guess I've always had a hard time letting go of it. So some of it's of course you want to say that it's all like about the creative potential of, thinking about both of them deeply and how they work together. And that's true. But some of it is also just orneriness, I think, kind of
Right.
persnicketyness.
Is there a difference? This might be a really reductive question, but is there a process difference for you in writing fiction versus nonfiction? Whether it is like a something that you write for a magazine, or when you were what was that? Remember that Medium publication?
Of course,
the Message.
The Message, on Medium, yeah.
And you would you write things like that, and then you are writing this fiction, and the interest. All of your interests come out in both of them. And I'm curious kind of about the difference between them, that kind of idea of building these whole worlds, but you're still feeding all of this stuff that you're interested in into versus just a straight essay or magazine piece or blog post.
Yeah, I think that they're more similar than different. I mean, of course, fiction just calls upon certain tools to kind of choreograph motion through space and kind of make sure people understand what's happening. And if you're writing something that's kind of more of a transcription of some thought process or trying to kind of lead people through a sequence of more abstract ideas, you don't need to do those things. It's a little different. But I would say broadly, and I think this actually says a lot about both the kind of fiction that I write and the kind of nonfiction that I write. They actually, like the way I think about it, the way I sit down to do it, is pretty similar. I always think of the main objective, like truly the one thing you have to do, as being simply keep people reading or turning the pages. That sense of kind of velocity and interest. And actually, I mean, I could go on and we could talk about this for an hour. All the little tools and tricks, including a bunch that I learned way back at the Pointer Institute, and still feel like I use them every day. And they totally apply to both forms. I've never written anything nonfiction that was, sort of proper narrative nonfiction. Sort of the closely reported timeline of some person's experience. I don't have the skills to do it. I would be super nervous about doing it. I would feel like I was going to get it wrong, because I probably would get it wrong. But I also just don't have the desire or temperament, whatever that is, that kind of practice and that craft is just, it's both not the stuff that I love the most in the world anyway. And I think you have to have that kind of covetous enjoyment yourself to really want to do it. But it's also just not what I've ever felt like I was good at or had the kind of knack for.
I've been thinking about fiction a lot lately. I've never written any fiction, although I have an increasing interest in it. I've been reading a lot more fiction, but I've been thinking about design. There's this term in design, and mostly in kind of academic circles, of design fiction or speculative design, which is maybe not necessarily problem solving, to kind of bring it back to our earlier conversation, but about using the design process to imagine different futures, with the hopes of kind of helping us get to that imagined world. And it's come up on the podcast a couple times, and I don't know if this is going to lead to a question, so I'll just tell you, I'll tell you that now. Part of this is just to maybe hear if you have any thoughts, or just to kind of articulate this for myself.
Oh. No, I do. It's funny. Here's a seed I'll plant, especially if you're getting more interested in that, in kind of following that thread and kind of thinking about it.
Yeah.
I do know about design fiction. I have in fact written a tiny bit of design fiction myself in a couple of different contexts for kind of different reasons to further different projects. And it actually relates back to thinking about form and content together. There's of course so many people fascinated by form and content and kind of imagining them together and imagining how an interesting form might then inflect or kind of transform the content. I would say, and this is going to sound a little bit like a blanket assessment, because it is, because it is. In general, those projects, in considering both the form and the content, somehow they end up not taking the content quite seriously enough. I think of these experiments, and there's so many of them that I've encountered, and I love them. I mean, I respect kind of the undertaking, and then what they produce is beautiful and interesting and kind of provocative. But then you actually start, reading the words. Maybe the words are presented on an iPhone screen and they're tilted at a 90-degree angle, and then you're zooming through like the whole of the O to get to the next sentence. Whatever. There's this cool stuff. You actually, read the sentences, and you're like, well, this is maybe C+.
Right.
And it really ought to be A+. Like the form is a solid A, a dizzying experiment. The words that are kind of bound up in this thing, they really ought to be an A+ as well. And they're not. Too often they're not. And I think the same thing about design fiction. I have been responsible for some of this design fiction myself, so I do not stand apart from this critique. But there's a lot of that stuff that there'll be some seed of a really dizzying idea, something cool and troubling and provocative. But the story itself, as a story, it's just plainly not an A+. It's a B- or it's a C+. And I think that's a shame. It's hard to write A+ short stories with any subject matter, with any objective. So maybe that's no surprise. But I would say that my broadly applied cocked eyebrow at that whole sort of genre is we got to make sure we're actually writing good sentences and writing good stories.
And this is interesting because I've talked to a lot of designers, obviously, and designers who are working in this kind of mode, and so a lot of the questions are questions of form. And so, as someone who's maybe on the other side of that, do you have thoughts on how to bring that kind of form and content closer together in these types of projects, or how to elevate those stories? Because it often, again, another blanket statement, coming from a design world, the form is often the thing that is the most interesting to us.
Yeah, of course.
So how do we bring those together? Or how do we start to kind of elevate both of them so they are influencing each other, so you don't have that kind of letdown? I know that's a big question.
It is a big question. I have to kind of tip my hand, which is that my sensibility for media, design, culture of all kinds leans really, really pop. I like the idea of things being not only accessible to a lot of people or everyone, but appealing and seductive, and magnetic, and just having that whatever those various sort of media pheromones are that kind of make people go, ooh, yes, more. We know now, I mean, like we have enough media in the world, great media, to demonstrate that the pop can also be serious and rigorous and sublime and everything else. So it's in no way sort of a trade-off between seriousness and that sort of pop sensibility or that pop appeal. So I say that only because I know some people might disagree with it. They might say that is a total, that's the wrong path. It actually doesn't matter. The things that we care about most now, they did not begin as pop projects. They did not imagine an audience for themselves. They were, poems written in a dark cabin with no expectation of ever being read, and in fact they never were until after their author died. Whatever, which is fine. I mean, that's actually a very interesting tension and an interesting conversation. However, if you accept at least a little bit my premise that that the sort of power of pop is appealing, then I think all it takes is a little more discipline. It takes the discipline to sit and look hard at what you're creating and ask, like, is this good enough? Does it have that sharpness? Does it have that like umami? And that you can achieve that so many different ways. It's like there's a whole toolbox of different things you can do, and they relate to voice and plot and different kinds of, I mean, of course, this is not just about language. You can do this with images and video and cinema and everything else as well. I think it takes being kind of hardcore and challenging yourself or your team to create something that sort of meets that standard.
I love that. I want to shift gears again a little bit because I want to talk about all this other stuff that you do. this kind of these machine learning experiments that you've been playing with, just programming in general. You're making olive oil.
Yes, of course. Yeah, it's the standard trifecta: fiction, machine learning, and olive oil.
Right,
I know,
right.
nothing could be more cliched.
Yeah. The reason I want to talk about it is because you tweeted something recently that I've been thinking about a lot, about how you have this kind of divide between work and then just, fooling around, or just kind of like tinkering with things. And I'm maybe this comes back to this media invention art monster thing. How do all of these things fit together? Do these things that, maybe are, quote, fooling around or fun or completely different than the writing and the media work, how do they start to kind of influence each other? Or what are the conversations that are happening between all of these projects that you're working on?
Oh yeah, I mean this is the thing that is so just truly powerful and seductive about fiction, is that anything can become material for that machine, truly, and it does in unexpected, sort of slow burn, chaotic, very path dependent ways. It's awesome. It's really to kind of see things that emerge and it successfully, the things that really matter in central ways to stories, and then ask yourself, where did that come from? And realize it's some really random experience 12 years ago, or the beginning of some interest, a decade ago. That's cool. That's a very satisfying thing to see. Now, the flip side is that this becomes a very, how do I say it? An almost like perfectly powerful excuse to waste time and or money on anything, because you can say, well, yeah, but it's going to be material for fiction,
right?
And you're not wrong, actually,
right.
But I've seen myself maybe play that card a little too liberally. Like, I only have so many in my deck, and maybe a few of these projects should be a little bit curtailed, because I'm not going to write that many books.
yeah
in my whole lifetime. So, but that's all to say that it does matter, and it's learning about the deep history of things. It's getting engaged in subcultures and learning how people in subcultures think and talk and communicate with one another. I mean, the Olive Grove, that was a total unexpected thing in my life. I mean, you follow the steps and they all make perfect sense. And if I kind of told you the story, you'd be like, well, yeah, of course you're managing a 3-acre olive grove with your partner. It was inevitable, but it definitely did not seem inevitable a couple of years ago. And as you might expect, for someone who spends a lot of time in front of screens and soldering irons and kind of hunched over desks, being out in the world in a grove of trees is a pretty different experience. And for me, that's been a stockpile of just sensory stuff. I mean, some of the things I've smelled and heard, like just these odd sounds, sounds of the world and sounds of farming spaces in particular, and feelings and the way that different tasks and failures feel. I mean, that is all just some of it. Much of it is literally going into the notebook. And of course, more is kind of just filtering into my brain to emerge again in unforeseeable ways.
yeah. I mean, hearing you talk about this excuse of spending money or wasting time is actually really refreshing.
And I actually think there's a way in which it can become, if you frame it that way, and maybe just accept that there's always going to be that tension, the tension between this is extremely high class procrastination,
right?
And no, it actually is the work, or it's at least part of the work. And for me, it's changed the way that I do some of these things. I truly believe that I certain things that I read are kind of like things I start researching, or kind of, I have a sewing machine here in this room with me, and I've been doing these sewing projects.
Oh, interesting.
And if I didn't have this other kind of context, I don't think I would have paid attention as much in a way. I am doing this sewing stuff kind of knowing or expecting that there's going to be some character in a story or some kind of scenario that involves sewing and fashion and clothes and the way this stuff gets made. And it becomes just I think a cool way to kind of engage with this stuff. And it certainly means that I take more notes. I am a compulsive, just huge note taker and of course that's interesting ideas I encounter out there in the world, but it's also just things that I kind of notice in myself. And it can be, again, the way doing a certain task feels. If I just notice it, I'm like, oh, this is funny. it's interesting how this, my arms are tired after doing this for only a little while. I'll like make a note of that, or just some little scribble to kind of remind me. Because that, I mean, I've been doing it for 10 years now, and that big pile of notes, it's just an absolute treasure. There's so much weird, good stuff in there.
I asked that question very selfishly because I am working for myself basically for the first time in my life over the last year, and the hardest part of that has been kind of, this sounds so stupid, but it has just been how I spend my time, because there is this scaling of, there are things that are, not work, or there are things that are like research, and maybe that's watching Netflix or reading a book or something. And then there are things that are producing things, but they're not making money, whether that's writing something or this podcast. For you could argue.
Right.
And then there's the stuff that makes money, and there's that scaling, and kind of figuring out how much time I can spend on each of those things has become a really interesting and challenging kind of thought experiment. And I apologize for the reductive question, but what's your day? What's a day look like for you that's jumping between sewing and writing and machine learning and olives?
Let me sort of interject something different before answering that question, which is just as I think about you contending with that and trying to justify your Netflix viewing or whatever, it makes me think that maybe there's an analogy to the way that maybe this has always been an ongoing conversation. I feel like I've only been exposed to it in recent years, sort of a sense that it's really helpful to everyone if people talk about money more, how they make money, where it comes from, how they think about it, how they plan it, what the sort of struggles and kind of hangups are, because it's one of those things where it's out there in the open and you realize that your own experience is, maybe you realize it's not normal, maybe you realize it's deeply normal. The point is you can kind of plot it on a spectrum, or on sort of in a field of possibilities, rather than just being this point alone in the world and you're like, am I doing it right?
Right.
So with that, and so anyways, I think that's all great, and actually just really, really healthy and useful. I wonder if some accounting of this stuff, of time spent just absorbing other things and enjoying them, like not treating it like homework, but watching movies and absorbing things on Netflix and reading design books and browsing the internet and everything else. I wonder if actually a more public and honest accounting of those things by a lot more people wouldn't be interesting and healthy and productive. And I'm thinking of something specific, which is a list published. I don't know if it's been published in previous years as well, but I know this last January, Steven Soderbergh, director, published this sort of really hilarious. Hilariously
I
stark,
love these.
His media list. So first of all, the fact that he keeps that list at all is just wild to me, amazing. Yeah. I was like, after I saw it, I was like, so yeah, I guess if people don't know, it's his accounting of all the media he consumed in the whole year, and it's full and it's complete. And in reading through it, you see that Steven Soderbergh, who is very successful and one presumes, certainly busy and occupied and engaged, he watches like a minimum of a movie a day. I mean, he is just, and like often, like it'll be some Saturday and he queues up 3 movies.
Yeah.
And there's also books and music and stuff sort of filtered in there as well. So first of all, and it turns out that's hard to do. After I saw that list the first time, I was like, I too will keep this accounting.
Yeah,
how interesting.
I'm doing it this year.
Oh, you're doing it? Oh, good. Yeah. See, good for you. I added 3 movies to like a Google spreadsheet and I punked out. I just was like, I can't deal with this. But I found it quite radical to look at that and actually just realize how much of his day you were seeing kind of accounted for.
That's really
and
interesting.
To kind of go, wait a minute, maybe this is it. Maybe he is Steven Soderbergh because he takes this part of it so seriously.
That's so interesting.
This is the work. It really is the work.
I've been following these lists of his for a couple years now, and I have never thought about it that way before.
Yeah, and so it's one of my favorite things in the world is sort of to think about and sort of, I don't know, it's just delightful and strange the way human brains work. The way we sort of conceive or imagine other people's lives. And those other people could be Beyonce and Jay-Z, they could be Barack Obama, they could be our friends, our peers, our arch nemesis, whatever. And it's so, you think about what actually happens in your day that you know about, and you realize that like you never afford any other human, that rich and textured a life. Like it always, like, I don't even know what I imagine that other people do, particularly people that other writers, I'm like, oh, I would imagine if I could be a writer like that, or if I could write books like that. And it's so I think again that Soderbergh thing is actually a great public service, and maybe there's more work to be done in sort of uncracking the reality of how people, in particular creative people, spend their hours and their days and allocate time to precisely to those different categories that you sketched out.
Yeah, there was a Slate podcast a couple years ago called Working, where they would interview people and basically just have them go through their day at work. This is what I do when I get to the office. And I found it so fascinating because, especially when I worked in offices, I would just look around at everyone else there and not, this is going to sound kind of condescending or arrogant, but it was, how is that thing that you do a full-time job? Like, what are you doing all day? And it wasn't that I thought they weren't working, but I just couldn't figure out basically any career that's more than 5 degrees away from what I do. I just have realized that I don't really know anything about. And the podcast was great because suddenly you could see what a mortician does for 8 hours a day, or what a programmer or whatever. And so I think I'd never made those connections that you just made. I think that's so interesting. What are subjects or topics that you're thinking about right now? What's kind of on your mind? What's getting you excited?
Well, you mentioned machine learning before, and I've been dabbling, tinkering, sort of, experimenting with some of these machine learning techniques as they apply to text in particular, and generating text and kind of transforming text for a couple years. It's been just about a solid 2 years now, and it continues to be very provocative and kind of magnetic for me. My next fiction project, probably the next novel, is going to use some of those techniques. It's going to it's going to flow into the text itself. Again, it's I almost think I need to stop saying that out loud because going back to the earlier part of the conversation, I don't want it to be the gimmick of the form. I want it to be A+. I want it to be A+ prose. And by the way, if you're interested, some of it was generated in this sort of odd and new way, but I can't deny that I am in fact really compelled by the form, or I guess that would be the mechanism, and the way it all works, and the things I've learned about those techniques, that the community of people, kind of pushing the state of the art in AI and machine learning forward, the way it's made me think about my own brain, and writing and creativity. It's really pretty trippy and kind of dizzying. So that continues to be a big strand of work for me. And then I still think comic books are the ultimate medium. And so I don't know. I've been trying to. I guess it's like two. This is actually good. It's a good kind of two ends of the spectrum. On one end, it's like this kind of very well established project that I feel like I've made real progress on and developed a certain amount of kind of enthusiast level expertise, very technical, very machiney. And then the other one, which I've barely begun, and I'm still horrible at, but I used to draw more, and I would like to start drawing a little bit more again, and maybe just I feel like if I could write like a 12-panel comic and post it on the internet, that would be success. That would be like, my work here is done.
Yeah. I love that.
That's the other thing I'm thinking about.
That's a good way to kind of segue into the last question, and this is how I end every interview. Who are the writers, or what are some of the books that you find yourself returning to again and again, or even the people that have shaped all of this that we've talked about, the way you think about these things? If someone listening is kind of really interested in this, who are the people on that reading list?
Oh man, I should have prepared for that one. I'll say what springs to mind immediately, which is going to be a super weird grab bag.
Yeah, that's all I ask.
Whenever people talk about kind of like what to read next after Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, the novel, or kind of what extends those themes, or kind of rhymes, with that book in a way, I always tell them that if they are interested in the history of books, the real gnarly, like down and dirty history of books, not the sort of the magic of printing. Then there's a book called The Book in the Renaissance by Andrew Pettigrew. It's a slim little volume. It's one of those great histories that's like it tells you all the good stuff about the rise of printing and publishing, the economics of it, the stories of these different publishing houses like stealing from one another. I mean, it's like they were printing Cicero, so like it's all like very like sort of high culture, but man, there were some like back alley deals happening.
Oh, interesting.
And, like, it's so good. It was one of those things that really cracked open that world and that time for me. So So I always recommend that to people. The Book in the Renaissance. Boy, I mean, this is going to be so unsurprising to your listeners, but I have read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud probably 10 times. It does, if people know it but haven't read it like in the last 2 years, I encourage them to go back to it.
Yeah, and I got to reread it.
Yeah, you'll find this like better than you remember it, and has so much to say. It's one of those books that's just almost spookily prescient about things that aren't even comics. I mean, I think it has a lot to say about the web, about digital design, just about everything. It's awesome. I was probably my single biggest fanboy experience. Often I'll get asked to kind of interview authors when they come into town. I'm like the person at the bookstore who I'm the Jarrett. I ask them questions when they come into town with a new book, and they sort of politely answer them, and then we turn it over to the audience, and then they sign their books. So Scott McCloud was coming into town with his new sort of opus graphic novel called The Sculptor a little while ago, and the bookstore invited me to interview him, and I was just like vibrating. It was amazing. And what else? Here's a curveball. All right, so that's the one that's like yeah, of course. Here's the curveball. It's another book about media. It is a little bit hard to get your hands on. You can get it online, but it ends up costing like $40 or $50. It is a book by someone named Mitchell Stevenson. Okay. It's called. This is a very Jarrett Fuller book, by the way. I don't know if you ever read this. It's called The Rise of the Image, The Fall of the Word.
No, I don't know this.
It was written in 1998, which is, in fact, like in some ways, it's like a very unfortunate moment to be writing that book, because there's like this digital video future that he foresees and kind of talks about and just explores, but basically no internet. Like the whole. I mean, there's an internet, but there's no video internet. Right. There's not even any prospect of a YouTube. No way of even a glimmering, anything like that. So, of course, the title of the book tells you everything. The Rise of the Image, The Fall of the Word.
Yeah.
All of its predictions are basically wrong or have turned out to be wrong. But it is still like the essence of it is so bracing and so provocative and in a way so utopian. I mean, it's really about it's kind of, there's a diagnosis and a prescription. The diagnosis is about sort of the rise of video and visual culture. And then the I guess maybe it's a prognosis, not a prescription. It's about how to maybe make video and moving images denser and richer, and even to give them some of the properties of words and sentences and paragraphs. Super speculative. Lots of pictures, lots of cool like sort of screen grabs of things kind of interspersed with the text. I read it pretty shortly after it came out, and it seemed like a amazing vision of the future. It was actually one of the things that made me want to work at Current TV in San Francisco. And I still go back to it sometimes. It's one of those, I think that's an amazing thing to pull off. To write a book that is at least in part sort of looking forward, to have it turn out to be completely wrong, but it's still great. I mean, It's still like, I find it actually quite inspiring. So for anybody who's interested in kind of the culture and just the grammar, actually, that's the right word for it, the grammar of video and moving images, it's really worth seeking out. The Rise of the Image, The Fall of the Word.
That sounds great. I'm going to try to find myself a copy of that as soon as we hang up this call.
Great.
Robin, this was so fun for me. I mean, like I said, I'm pretty sure I kind of came across you and your work my senior year in college, and I don't mean to end this overly sentimental, but I feel like your writing and thinking and just kind of publicness has really shaped so much of kind of my adult what it means to be a creative person life. I feel like I've just learned so much from you over the years, and so I'm really glad that I finally have you on the podcast. So thank you so much. This was so fun.
Oh man, well Jared, it's a total honor to join you here, and I think this project is truly the coolest thing. So thank you for inviting me.
This episode was recorded on July 6th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.